which are told. The first one is that of the poor struggling author, right? So very typically what this entails is most independent musicians are at the receiving end when it comes to negotiating their rights, or rather that they have no negotiating power at all. And the story is that of exploitation. Right? So very typically what would happen is that you would have an independent musician, and this is particularly true in the film industry. An independent musician is contracted for peanuts. All the rights are assigned either to the producer or to the music director in terms of the well-known name, and the musician gets nothing out of this. This is one story. The other kind of story is really the story about what happens to the larger question of musical creativity itself as copyright begins to expand more and more. And what I want to look at is really the intersection of these two stories, particularly when they confront kind of technologies which allow for distribution in a way that you didn't have before, namely the internet. But for the first story, there's an interesting tale, and for this, a highly recommended book is Shiva Vaidyanathan's Copyright and Copywrongs, which approaches the history of copyright law from the perspective of cultural production. So he's essentially a historian of various kind of cultural forms, including hip-hop, and he tries to argue and shows you how, as copyright laws become more stringent, it's not just a matter of law, it's not just a matter of development of legal doctrine or legal principles, but that the impact on cultural form is very, very acute. And in the case of hip-hop, what he demonstrates is that one of the practices that was critical or essential to hip-hop was sampling. But because of the entire kind of, the fact that fair use doctrines were really kind of getting tightened and lessened, people were able to sample less and less. And the quality of hip-hop, therefore, as a consequence, changed drastically. But the story that I want to begin with is really a story of two songs. And we can combine this into, kind of a musical quiz. So this is the first song. You can identify it. So this is Willie Dixon playing Muddy Waters' You Need Love.
Oh, so the other ones were not allowed.
Yeah, so then there is Led Zeppelin, which is, yeah. So very familiar riff. So what happened essentially was that Willie Dixon's daughter heard, Whole Lotta Love, and figured that this sounded very kind of similar to her dad's song, and went back and figured that it was indeed, kind of substantially based on You Need Love.
Well, it happened with a lot of Led Zeppelin music.
Well, I mean, so it happens with all kinds of musical traditions more generally, right? The whole of Elvis is a reworking of, kind of black African-American musical traditions. The difficulty of the question here is that what happens, right? I mean, here is an example of, let's say a really well-off band. In a way, piggybacking on music that someone else has composed, or even if they learnt it, the other person is not getting any benefit out of this. So in this case, Willie Dixon, Zestate, they sued Led Zeppelin. And the matter was settled out of court for a substantial amount. And the amount was used by Willie Dixon to set up a blues foundation to support retired blues artists who did not have a source of income. And as a way of ensuring, as it were, some kind of continuity of the blues tradition. Now this is a fairy tale kind of romance where the small artist compared to the big one wins the battle, and the benefits actually flow to the entire musical community. But then it's never that kind of straightforward, because you have an example like this, but then as you will see, there are a number of other examples where as copyright expands, it also expands into the entire terrain of what it is to actually, what does it mean to own something like a musical tradition itself. Because in a way, music poses the ultimate challenges to copyright law. Now, important to remember that copyright law began in the 18th century within a particular technology, the technology of paper. So it emerges in the print revolution. But the key doctrines, you've done copyright.
Right.
So the key doctrines in copyright law: originality, authorship, and the idea expression dichotomy. All of these emerge in the context of the print revolution. They emerge specifically, historically, in the context of the response or romanticism to what they see as the industrialization of all forms of life, including creativity. Right? So this is the industrial revolution, the print revolution is happening, and there is this kind of claim that's emerging. And the response at that point of time of romanticism is because the argument was that it's not about the copy itself. Because earlier orders of value was the very copy itself. But when a technology comes in which does away with the transaction cost of copying, namely time and money and effort, then the question is what value is there in this? So romanticism, by way of Shelley, Wordsworth, etc., all of them started developing a doctrine of what is known as a romantic author, right? Which is, the idea is that what is being protected here is not the physical, but the intangible expression of my authorship. So it's a spirit that cannot be commodified. Now, that's in authorship. Originality, again, was the idea that you look at something and create something out of nothing, right? So very typically you go to nature and you write a poem about it, right? You create something literally out of nothing. So genius was at the key to this. The problem that emerges when you start translating some of these doctrines to other areas of cultural production, including music or art, is that they don't have the same genealogy. They don't have the same history. So the idea of what constitutes originality for music is a very basic question. Right? I mean, because in a lot of ways, any musician would be able to tell you this. The best way of learning music is by mimesis, is by copy. Every single indie rock band in India starts by doing cover versions, right? So in a way, there is an inculcation of a certain kind of a musical tradition, not just in an abstract sense, but in a very corporeal sense, in a very kind of a bodily manner. And there's a good example of this in terms of as a contra. One of the people who was sued the most number of times for copyright infringement was Helen Keller, the famous blind author. And the reason being that when she was actually, in one of the cases, she makes the argument that you read with your eyes, but I read with my hands. And when I read with my hands, I incorporate and I embody what I'm reading in a very different way from what you read. And by the time I write, I cannot make a distinction between what I have read as someone else's and what I write as mine, right? So this kind of corporeality to the way that she talks about a form of learning is also very true in music, because it requires that kind of, discipline and dedication of sitting for hours, plucking away on a string or beating away on a drum, which embodies a certain mode of mimesis. And this, in a way, is the challenge, because what copyright does when it encounters music is that it really kind of complicates the scenario of where do we draw these lines of originality, idea expression dichotomy. I mean, to take idea expression dichotomy, for the lay people, what is an idea expression dichotomy? The common myth is, and you speak to anyone, they'll tell you that intellectual property and copyright protects ideas. Copyright does not protect ideas, it only protects unique expressions and ideas. And the distinction between the two would be boy meets girl, they fall in love, is an idea. Boy meets girl in England, they go on a trip around Europe, girl comes to Punjab, boy follows girl to Punjab, is a unique expression of the idea boy meets girl, they fall in love, and that's Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge, right? So if you were effectively to grant any kind of protection over ideas, what you would be doing is granting monopoly over an idea which no one else can then use at all, right? And this is very different from patent law, which actually allows you to do this. So if you take the idea expression dichotomy and push it into the realm of music, what happens, right? So is, for example, because in a lot of ways, music collapses the idea expression dichotomy. Is the sixth string note of happy birthday to you an idea or an expression? If you played it the same note at a different tempo, would that be a new expression of an idea? Or would that be, a copy? If you played